Pardon me, please?
Welcome everybody to the Kansas City Woodworkers Guild's February 2023 Skill Builder. We're in for a treat today as a legendary Dave Kratz is going to give us all kinds of advice on making jigs. So without further ado, I turn it over to Dave. Dave, thank you.
I always hate introductions like that because I don't know whether I have something to live up to or something to live down. It's good to be back with everybody, and good to see that Joe. You've seen this presentation how many times? A bunch. Okay. Wait, would you like to get up here and do it?
I'll let you. I'll let you.
Okay. We don't have the video up yet. There we go. I've got to apologize to you and tell you that this is not a new presentation, but it shouldn't be. I've got some new elements into it, but you can see from the presentation here on my laptop, I gave this presentation in May of 2018, and most of the pictures are from that time, but we will talk about jigs today. And the important thing about jigs is that if you don't know that you need one, you don't. And most people take a wrong tack on building jigs because they try to build a jig that what I call a Swiss Army knife jig. Does everybody know what a Swiss Army knife jig, Swiss Army knife is? You know, you got this, and I think they're still made by the Victronics company, and some of them have as many as 10 or 12 blades, and they've got saws, and they've got corkscrews, and they got leather punches, and they got screwdrivers. And one of the things that you find out about a Swiss Army knife, the only thing that a Swiss Army knife does is use the knife blade to cut string or something like that. It cuts well. Everything else is a compromise. And if you try to make a general use jig, except for a couple of instances, you're kind of in trouble because there is no Swiss Army knife jig. And in building jigs, you have to define your problem first. And you have to know what you want the jig to help you do. So with that in mind, I'm going to take a different approach today talking about jigs, because in every case when I show you a jig, I'm going to point out the basic elements in jigs, and we'll get to that in just a minute, but I'm going to point out the basic elements in jigs and show you how all jigs are just a reiteration every day, and you can see how to put jigs together. I always get fearful of the term legendary, I think is the term that Kevin used. You make jigs to solve a problem, and you have to define the problem. And if you can't define the problem, your jig is probably not going to do the job for you. My background and my history and my endeavor throughout life has been solving problems as an engineer. And if you can't make a good problem statement on anything, I don't care what it is, then you're kind of flying blind to do what you want to do. So with that in mind, we'll tackle this idea of jig making, and I'll show you some of the basic elements in jigs, and then we will go on from there. If you would, Chris, go to the next slide, jigs or fixtures. Okay. Jigs or fixtures. A lot of people use the term interchangeably, as do I. I call them all jigs. But if you want a demarcation between jigs and fixtures, fixtures hold or position work to allow it to be tooled. They're usually a stationary thing, like a carver's vise. You attach your piece of material to it, and then you attack with a chisel. Okay, that is a fixture. Jigs hold the work to allow you to take it to the tool. You hold the work in a sled. We'll talk about the sled here in a minute. You hold the work in your sled so that you have a fence and you can advance to the blade. Yes?
We're going to trade your microphone because that one is not nice.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
No,
Not yet.
you're not on yet.
Oh, I'm not on.
Poor guy.
Okay.
All right, try that now.
Can everyone hear me now? Okay. We're ready to go. And like I was saying, jigs hold the work to allow you taking it to a tool. It's hard to tell the difference in a lot of cases because in a lot of cases you combine the two elements, and I call them all jigs. I just refer to them as all of them as jigs. And as I said, there's no Swiss Army knife type jig. A jig generally solves a specific problem, and in a lot of cases a jig will make one cut or one operation, and that serves us very well because jigs locate things and help you introduce your material to the tool. Let's hit the next slide there. There are 5 jig components that you need to worry about when you build a jig. And in every case, the first one you need to define is where your cut line is. You're using a piece of material and you want to cut it in a certain place, and you need to define where that cut line is because you're going to build your jig around that cut line. So the first question you always ask is, where will the saw cut? Or where will the drill or router center point be? Where will the drill drill the hole? Where will the router route the slot or whatever? So you establish your cut line. The next element on jig building is a fence. What distance do I need to hold from the cut line or the drill center or the router bit or whatever tool you're using? And those 2 elements are the most important because your cut line is where you want a tool. Your fence is what you use to guide your material past the tool. And there's always an element of clamping. How do I hold the work? And we'll see some cases here as I go through this that holding the work is extremely important because a lot of times you make jigs to hold small pieces, and we got a rule here in our shop that you need to stay clear of the blade by 3 inches. If your piece is only 2.5 inches long and a 1/2 inch wide and whatever, how do you hold that piece and remain your 3-inch distance that we adhere to here in the shop? So usually you have to have some kind of clamp or slot or wedge or something to to hold the tool or to hold the work. And then finally there's a stop, because a lot of times the reason why you make a jig is so you can stop your cut in a precise location. You're making pieces and you want them all to be the same. Stopping the cut is very important, and stopping the cut is different on different tools. You stop the cut in a different place when you're running on a router, because the router bit is round and you can only go to the outside radius before you have to stop that cut and then use a chisel to clean up the inside. On a table saw, you have to stop your cut early because the curvature of the blade will saw past your stop line. So you always need to understand where to stop your cut. So those 5 jig components, keep those in mind. Your cut line, your drill or router center point, your fence, your clamp, and your stop. And I might mention at this point in time, fences have a different definition. And you're used to, and I know most of you are used to thinking of a fence like the device on a table saw that clamps there and keeps you this far from the blade. Fences also exist on routers, but if you've got a bearing guided bit, you don't use the fence. Where is your fence on a bearing guided bit?
The bearing.
It's the bearing, okay? And keep that in mind. Your fence is not always a fence like it looks like on the table saw. A fence may be a block that holds a piece upright as you go through the saw. And in a lot of cases on table saws, your fence goes parallel to the blade. A lot of times you have to relocate the fence to saw perpendicular to the blade or angled to the blade, and you have elements and jigs to be able to do that I will show you. Let's go to the next slide there. Okay, 5 jig components. Most jigs are a combination of these things that I just told you. Jigs solve problems of work holding and positioning. So you want a piece of material in a certain attitude, a certain location, and a certain angle to go through the cut line. And so jigs solve problems of work holding and positioning. Jigs allow for repeated cuts. Most of the time when you're making something one-off, you don't worry about a jig because you only have to make one piece. And you have to make that piece anyway to make a jig. So if you're making 2 or 3 or 5 or 500 is when you start talking about a jig. So jigs allow for repeated cut. Jigs allow for uniformity. If you're making 50 pieces for the same use, you want them all the same. Jigs allow you to make a lot of pieces, not very easily, but in a repeatable, safe manner, so that you can amplify your work. The most common jigs in our shop are the table saw fence, the bandsaw fence, drill press fence, and joiner fence. Fences position your work parallel to the cut line. Okay, your cut line in those cases is the blade or the router bit. Your fence positions your work in relation to that. Okay, and like I said, you're going to find places where you have to relocate the fence or augment the fence. So be on the lookout for fences where you didn't expect them to be. Okay, we'll look at those 5 components repeatedly as we go through this. The first one, next slide.
Would a stop block on the fence be what you're talking about adding to the fence?
Yes, and I'll show you that here in just one quick minute. Okay, let's talk about making a table saw sled. And I'll tell you from experience, and long experience, as my grandfather used to say, I've been around since the moon was real small and there weren't any stars at all. And I've used a table saw fence ever since I've had a table saw. And if you have a table saw and you don't have a fence, I would highly recommend that you make one and learn how to use it, because it's a very safe way to use a table saw. But let's look at a table saw sled. Okay, this is one from here in the shop. And a table saw sled is about the handiest thing you can have for a table saw. And it is a jig because it does one thing. It gives you, actually it does several things, but it gives you a sliding table. It's much easier to hold your work and position it. But the next thing it does, you'll probably notice right quick, is it relocates your fence. Okay, because your old fence was this way, and on a sled your fence is perpendicular to the blade. Okay, and it would stand to reason that now you're thinking I'm using the sled for cross-cutting operations. I use the longitudinal fence for ripping operations, and you'd be exactly right. So the first thing you do is evaluate the operation that you're going to do. So on making a sled, does everyone have a sled for your table saw?
Nope.
No? Okay. Are you interested in how to build yourself a sled that works?
Yep.
Okay, let's talk about that. What happened to my sled? Making a table saw sled. There you go. Making a table saw sled. This is the sled on my table saw at home. Right here. This is a Powermatic 66. I've had it since 1982. It's a workhorse saw. And I keep a sled on top of that saw probably 95% of the time for stuff that I do. And you really have to size it for what you do. But for stuff that I do, that sled stays on the saw about like 95, maybe more than that. Because anymore, I generally use a bandsaw for ripping. If I have to rip a long piece, but of course I collect tools. I have a 20-inch bandsaw, and it is a very good tool for ripping, and I get a lot better results from that. And I don't get the wide kerf that I get in a table saw, so I use a bandsaw for ripping. But for cross-cutting operations and for precise repetitive operations, I use my table saw as a cross-cutting device, and I use a sled. You'll see on the sled that there is a back fence, and on my back fence, on my back fence you see a sliding stop, okay? And I use that sliding stop, like right here. I use that sliding stop almost continuously. When you want to cut pieces, like if you're cutting a small blank for something you're doing like that, you can set this against your blade, your stop against that. You can cut 500 of these, all exactly the same size, by using a stop. Your cut line is here, your piece is there, my stop is here. So using a stop block is an augmentation to your table saw sled. And I would exhort you, if you don't have a sled for your table saw, to build yourself one. Let's look very quickly at how you might make a table saw sled for your saw. This is a recommended first jig for your shop, and it establishes a fence square to the cut line. And you remember, your cut line is here, okay? You're establishing a square relationship to that cut line, and the first thing you want to do is, well, this talks about the sled. It's safer because the cutoff stays on the sled. When you cut something off, the piece is either here, or if you're feeding a piece through here, your stock stays there, your piece comes off here, you slide back. You can take this off because your blade is up here. Okay, you keep yourself away from the blade. It's safer to work with a sled on a table saw. Work may be clamped to the fence. If you have a piece you want to hold absolutely square, it's easy to take this and clamp it to a fence. Just put your little clamp across there, and you don't even have to worry about whether you're shaky holding your work. You can clamp the piece and cut it very precisely. Auxiliary fences may be used, and it may be used with a dado stack, and normally we use a separate sled because a dado stack makes a wider kerf here. I don't know how many of you get the bulletin from Woodsmith magazine. They put out one last week on how to make a table saw sled with an adjustable face over here so that you can narrow or widen the cut line and use it both for a dado stack or a regular table saw blade. And I would ask you to look at that if you're thinking about building a sled, because it is a very, very good idea. Your sled may enable you to cut tenons, cross laps, and box joints, which are difficult to do freehand, but we have a project in the basic woodworking class where you cut cross laps, and I don't think we could do that without a sled. Is that right, Norman? I don't think that you could accomplish that without a sled. Let's look at how, some pointers on building a good sled. Okay, your alignment steps. When you build a sled, and most of them are built out of 1/2-inch plywood on the bottom, and the reason why 1/2 inch rather than 3/4 inch, 3/4 inch is more stable, but 1/2 inch allows you that extra 1/4 of an inch of blade height, and you want that. So I would recommend 1/2 inch down here, but the important part of your sled is this part right back here, okay? That is the back edge of your sled, and that has to be straight because that's what you align everything to, okay? And you establish your cut line. Where on your sled do you want the blade to come through? And you establish either your right or your left. It doesn't make any difference, your right or your left miter slot, and put it on first exactly square to this back edge, okay? And then you take some double-faced tape on this miter slot, or on this miter strip, and put this down in place, and when you fix this in place square to that, now you have squared this, and when you lay it down, your double-faced tape sticks this to the bottom so that they're parallel based on your saw's grooves, okay? And don't expect your saw to fit any other. We got 5 saw stop saws here, and in some cases a sled for one won't fit on another one, and I don't know why that's sloppy machining goes on like that, but it does. So you're making a device for your saw, And now when you get that stuck down, you can come back and you can put screws in it, and now you have established a square reference point, your back fence, to your sled, and now you can drop it there and you can run your blade across this, and you have established your cut line square to this. Okay, when you put this piece on back here, you don't worry about it. You make it tall enough to where the blade won't cut through it, and it's purely decorative. Don't try to square it to anything. Just line it up to the back edge, because your important part is right here and right there in those two runners. When you have a table saw sled, let's go to the next slide. Well, next slide after that. You can saw with a stop. You can take a small block. Like I said, if you want to put a block 6 inches out here, clamp it down, you can take a piece of material and always come up against that against that stop block, and you can repeatedly cut those pieces. And a lot of your projects, like table legs, stool legs, something like that, you want them all the same, right? So you set your distance from your blade face to the front end of your stop block, and then you can repeat that cut.
Excuse
Yes.
me. Have you ever used like the 4-cut square thingy to try and actually make sure that that back fence is parallel? In other words, they normally put like one screw in one end and then tape or something on the side, and then they do 4 cuts around to measure how much off it is.
No, I have not used that. I can plead ignorance on that, because I've been doing this long enough to where I can read a square and line that up square. But I'm not familiar with what you're talking about.
Okay, it was just a method that they could tweak in that back fence until they absolutely got it square,
Okay.
instead of just a hair off.
I'm going to show you in a minute how to do that on a miter cut.
Okay, thanks.
All right. All right, so that's sawing with a stop. Now, a lot of times, and I'll show you a little table picture here in just a bit, but a lot of times you don't want your cut line square with your stock, okay? You want to saw an angled cut. Well, there's a couple of ways I do that. Let me see what I got here. Yeah, there's a couple of ways I do that. Next slide, Chris. Next one. Next. There you go. There's a couple of ways I do that. You notice on my sled right here, I've got holes drilled through it, and I've got T-nuts on the underside of that to where I can attach things to my sled. And I've got, I think, 6 down this side, and I know I've got 3 down this side. Anyway, you can attach different things to your sled, and here I have attached a toggle clamp so that I can angle my cut. Okay, I put a clamp here on my saw, and I can take a piece like this if I want to cut this angle, and I can set it down there, and I can clamp it on the sled and slide the sled across, and I am not worried with holding this attitude just exactly right going to the saw according to a line I draw there. My advice to you is don't try to do that, okay? If you've got an angle cut to make, tie it down to something, because when you're making an angle cut like this freehand, it is very easy to get caught very slightly, you know, a half a degree, and that'll catch the back of your blade, and it'll kick it up and hit you right in the face. And I'm sorry to tell you that I know that from experience, and it hurts. It hurts really bad. So don't do that. When you have to make an angle cut, do it like this, or there's another way you can do it. If you have to do it very much and you want repeatability, you make you an auxiliary fence to your sled at the angle that you want to cut, and you clamp it back here, and now you can put your workpiece up here however you want it, and now you've got a new fence. You have repositioned your fence, and you will find a need a lot of times to do that in your projects. I'll show you a small project here in just a minute where this was the key element to being able to make that project. So if you need to cut at an angle, make you an auxiliary fence to cut at an angle. Let's go on to the next slide here. Okay, making duplicate angle cuts, like you're making a box, and you make a box in rough to ready, right? Making duplicate angle cuts is a challenge because you want them all the same, and you want, I've got way too much stuff up here, and you want them all to be the same, and you want to be able to fine tune that. Here's an auxiliary fence, all right, and you'll have to tilt your blade, but if you clamp this on using the fence clamps, like right here, you have auxiliary fence that is your 45-degree angle. And the thing that I've added to this is sliding stop blocks, okay? And the great thing about these stop blocks, you can put them down, you can make your box end this way, flipping around and saw the same angle on the other side. On your long ones, you can flip this up and use that stop block to make the long side of your box. And you can make repeated boxes like this. Once you get your box cuts established, then you can set these stop blocks up, and you can make 50 boxes or 500 if you want them to. Now, there's a question that Chuck had on how do you get that tuned in exactly right. Okay, you'll see on my auxiliary sled there's a little set screw right there, and there's a little set screw right here. If I loosen my clamps, I can tune those and get those exactly square to that cut line. So a lot of times when you reposition your fence, you want to make that fence reposition finely adjustable. Okay, that is sawing angle cuts and making duplicate angle cuts. And like I told you, this little fence here, if you're making a splay leg table with tapered or with angled aprons, you want to be able to do that and make that repeated cut, because when you're making a splay leg table, all four of your aprons have to be the same. Let's go on, talk about two easy jigs for you to make. You'll see right here what I'm talking about, making the splay leg table aprons. You want those cuts to be angled on both ends. So instead of a square apron, you're making a trapezoid, you have to cut both ends the same. So you can use this little thing here to cut one end, and then just flip your board over and cut the other end. You've got precisely the same angle cut on both ends, and incidentally you can go past the router bit to make you a rabbet or a tenon or the dado or whatever. because now you have reestablished your cut line. This is your new cut line, and you can run that against the fence, and now you've got a angled tenon situation. So that's a way to extend the utility of your sled. Now there's an easy jig that you can make, and again, it's a kind of sled. A lot of us make tenons. You can make tenons with a router. You can make tenons with a dado. You can also make tenons with a table saw. And this little jig right here rides in your miter slot, either the left one or the right one, and you can determine that by where you place your vertical fence back here. And you'll see that this one is adjustable this way. So when you're riding in the miter slot, if you got a very narrow piece, your blade is right here. All right, you're sawing a wide piece, now your blade is right here. This is adjustable this way. It slides in the miter slot, and you can set up to make repeated cuts here. And this is a tenoning jig. Now, if you're into machines, you can buy one of these made out of cast iron by the saw manufacturer who made your saw, and you can pay $150 to $400 or $500 for one, depending on how fancy you make it, or you can make your own for $5. Okay, and that is a very handy jig for making tenons in pieces, because most of your furniture elements are held together by tenons. And so that's, where are we? That's two easy jigs that you can make for your saws. Now let's talk about, next slide, Chris. Let's talk about tricky angles. This little table actually sits in one of our bedrooms at home, and I made this several years ago. But the angle on this drawer that goes in there is the same angle as the table and the same angle as the aprons, and it was made with this little auxiliary fence to cut those angles. And I'll show you something kind of fun here in a minute, but this, and we're going to talk about tapers very shortly, but this and this angle there, and particularly the angle when you make a drawer, you always cut a slot in the bottom for the bottom of the drawer. How do you do that when you got an angled side and get that in there straight? That's kind of fun on a table saw, but you can do it. And here I'll show you how to do it. Let's zip on to the next one, Chris. You make you an auxiliary sled for your trim router, okay? And you take a piece of wood like this, and you saw it at that same angle on the table saw to where it's thinner over here than it is over there. That establishes this angle. But if you mount your router right up here, your bit comes through straight. So if this rides against your edge, it'll cut you a square groove in that side of your drawer. And that's the way you change your cut line for a different angle than your guideline on the bottom, because your bottom cut your bottom cut is like that. I don't have a picture to show it, but when you make an angled apron like that, and it's sitting on the table, the bottom edge has to be angled at the same angle, and the top edge has to be angled at the same angle. The way you get that angle on your table saw is very, very easy. You take this thing and you put it like that, and you adjust your saw blade to that, because that's exactly the same angle as the angle on your apron ends. Okay? You can take something like this and use it as a gauge for setting your angles after you saw the aprons. And so when you got tricky angles like that, and you're setting up pieces, you can make a jig for your router like this to cut a square slot into an angled face. And that's the whole exercise here. Let's hit the next one, Chris. Another very easy jig for you to make, and all of us do it all of the time, and very possibly unsafely. You ever have trouble when you're when you're ripping thin strips, getting the push stick between the fence and the blade? You get up there, and I've seen people fight that forever. Make you one of these. Okay, this is a very handy little jig to make. It's got a screen door roller, and you can buy these 2 in a package at your hardware store for about $3. I don't know how much they cost. And you make this little sliding thing like this, and you can see where it fits right here. Okay, and the little guide fits in the left table slot, and the slide is adjustable. You can move it as close to the blade as you want to, you know, a 32nd of an inch. And if you've got a jointed board, you keep sliding your fence over to bump this thing, and this determines the gauge of your strip rather than your fence. So what have you done here? You have moved your fence again, but you're still using your original fence to line the board up. And so you can do things like that. And I want to make a note here to everybody. One of the things you can do on a piece like this is this has a T-nut inside of it. And does everybody know what a T-nut is? It has a T-nut inside of it, and that T-nut will allow you to run a screw in like that and clamp this down, okay? But you can make you a very handy little thing like that for ripping thin strips, and do it very safely rather than fighting that push stick by the fence and the blade. Okay, let's ripping thin strips. Let's go to the next one. The box making jig is the same idea as a regular sled, but a 45-degree angle cut, and you use stop blocks for length and width, adjustable fence for error and sled wear, and clamp on fence for saw stops. This is a jig I've already showed you here, but let's go to the next one. This is the box making jig for my saw. It's got that adjustable auxiliary fence on a 45-degree sled, and it's got flip stops on it to where once I get my cuts set up, I can cut the four sides of the box progressively, all at the same angle, and I can make multiple boxes any size that I want. Now, it's an interesting side note. I've got to make me another one of these because I had a friend who had a Model 66 Powermatic saw just like mine, and several times he borrowed my box making jig like that. And usually about once a year he'd come over and borrow my box making jig and keep it sometime for 2 or 3 or 4 months, and I'd need it and I would go get it. And the last time I loaned it to him, he tricked me. He passed away before I went and got my box joint, or my box making jig back. And when they sold his tools in the estate sale, they sold my box making jig. So I have to make me another one. But that's my box making jig. And you'll note here that on the back fence that this is set screw adjustable, because a lot of times you need to finally adjust that so that you've got an exact fit on your boxes. And it's the same idea as these little set screws here on this. If you put this auxiliary jig on a 45-degree fence, then you can get in here and you can make a trial cut and fit that together. And if it's not exactly square, you can loosen your clamp and adjust these little screws to where you cock it just a gnat whisker, and you can get your miters exactly on that way. So that's a 45-degree box making jig, or you can make you an auxiliary fence for your sled like that. And that just shows you the cuts that you can make using those stop blocks. I'm not going to dwell on that one there. Let's talk about making taper jigs, because a lot of times you make something that you want a taper on it. Like that little table I showed you. This is a sample leg I made out of a piece of 2x4, but that's the leg for that little table. And you need to make if you're going to make tapered stuff, you need to make you a tapering jig. You know, get some of this stuff out of the way and show you how to set up a tapering jig. This is a tapering jig. All right, I have one at home just like this, and I made both of these. But what we did on this, or what you do when you make a jig like this, you've got a table runner that goes in your saw slot, and what you have done is what? You have relocated your fence, okay? And your fence in this case is what? Your table slot, okay? And when you establish your cut line, which is this right here, then you know that this is going to cut right along this line. Now, when you set this up for cutting tapers, I'm gonna get into one of my pet peeves right here. How many of you have one of these little plastic things at home that's like a half moon, and it's got degree marks around it? What do you call them?
Protractor.
A protractor. I call them one of the most maddening tools that you've ever tried to use in your whole life, okay? If you've got a protractor at home and you're a dedicated woodworker, throw it away, okay? And you throw it away for two reasons. It's extremely difficult to use, number one, because it was made for drawing pictures, okay, on a drawing tablet or a drawing board. And if you look at the little graduations on it, the plastic ones, their marks are wider than a degree. So you don't know where to make your mark on that molded plastic thing. If you get a Bureau of Standards certified one, it's going to cost you $150 or $200 for that little thing, okay? And I defy you to set up your machine for this taper with that little piece of plastic. The way you set up tapers, and incidentally, when you look on a plan for this little table, or any little table that's got splayed legs, what do they tell you your taper is? They probably tell you 5 degrees. How you're gonna set up 5 degrees on this? Anybody know, or can anybody do it?
Bevel gauge.
Pardon?
A bevel gauge?
No. There's a really easy way to do it that you don't even have to worry about degrees. You can erase that term from your vocabulary. Look on the plan and find out where on the leg the taper starts and make a mark. Look on the bottom of the plan and find out how wide the leg is down here. Okay? And you line this leg up. You line this leg up with your starting point at the edge of the, I have to do this right. You line your leg up with the starting point at the edge of your cut line. Okay, my mark is right here. Most of you can see it. And I've lined that mark up right at the edge of my cut line. All right, I'm gonna line this up right where my saw cuts. Okay, and I'm gonna clamp it down. Okay, get it lined up and clamp it down. Now, how many legs does a table have most of the time? 4. So I want to make all 4 of these exactly the same taper. Okay, I'll take these little spacers right here and put them right here. And my next leg that I line up, I don't have to worry about anything. I loosen the clamp and stick it in here, and I can saw it at that taper. And here, because I've relocated my fence and established a cut line, I can cut that taper. And did I mention, don't even utter the word degrees, okay? Because you'll drive yourself crazy trying to set up 5 degrees or 3 degrees on that. When you're cutting tapers in woodworking, define where your taper starts and how wide your taper ends. And that is often, if you remember high school algebra, that is the run of a graph over the displacement or the rise of a graph. So always measure and run, and measure offset in inches to your cut line. And you can make a taper without ever uttering the word degree. Okay? We'll get on another taper here in a minute that it's rather interesting, but that's how you make a taper cut and make you a tapering jig. That's not the only way to make one, but if you value your person, do not go and get one of these flimsy metal ones with a hinge at the bottom that opens up like this, and then you have to hold your board and you have to hold the jig all against the fence and make your taper cut. Those things are a good prelude to an accident, and don't do that. Okay, let's go to the next one. That's a table saw taper jig. You can make a bandsaw tapering jig exactly the same way. Okay, and this is a Nancy Hiller, passed away now, but Nancy Hiller was here several years ago, and we were making a similar table leg for her little writing desk project, but it had a foot on it about this wide, so you had to taper down to the foot, and you had to stop the taper or you would cut the foot off. And I wanted to mention that because right here on the tapering jig there's a little lug, and when it got to the table on the bandsaw, that caught the edge of the table and stopped your cut. And remember, one of the elements of jigs is where are you going to stop the cut, and that's you on your jigs you always take that into consideration so that you can stop your cut and make it repeatable there at that point in time. So that's the Nancy Hiller taper jig. I'm going to skip over a couple here because we also had a special sled for leg facing, and you don't need to worry about that right now. Let's talk about drilling jigs. On a drill press, you're really talking about the same idea, but I see people repeatedly here in the shop. When I'm shop foreman, they take the fence off of the drill press. Do you ever do that? Don't take the fence off the drill press. It's valuable to you because that fence establishes where your drill is going to drill and makes it repeatable, okay? And you use your fence on the drill press and you turn the drill press into an X, Y, Z axis tool. Your fence tells you how far from your drill you're drilling. Your stop block on the fence tells you how far this way, and your drill stop tells you how far the drill is going to come down. So if you want to be repeatable, you can't get up there and hold your stock with one hand, without the fence incidentally. Hold it with one hand and drill down here while you're watching the drill go in. Because if you do that, you're inviting an accident. One of my worst injuries in the shop came from a drill press. And you want to be careful with the drill press because I was using a brand new Irwin spade bit, okay? And on a hole that I drilled probably 3,000 or 4,000 times before, and I threw this piece up on the drill, and this brand new spade bit caught in the piece of work and started twirling it around and jammed my thumb right into the spade, and I took off about that much of my thumb. Thankfully, it's grown back, but that was my worst accident simply because I didn't clamp stuff down on the drill press, and I didn't use the fence. So when you use a drill press, you clamp your stock for safety to keep you from getting hurt. And you can see an example of that right here. Next slide, Chris. Okay, right here we got a drill press. Your fence is back there regulating the distance from the fence. You got a stop block up there, and you can stop your hole going into the stock. So when you're using a drill press, use that fence. And remember, the larger your drill, the slower speed you want to go. And that's a drill press with stops and clamps. Let's talk very quickly about toy making jigs, because here in our shop we have a couple of annual events making toys, and jigs are very handy for making toys, because when you make toys you generally make a lot of them. And on something like a little truck like this, you're making a little truck, there's a couple of ways that you want to regulate the cuts for repeatability, and one of them is the holes that you drill for the axles right down here. Okay, you can set you up a jig like this for your drill press, and now we have relocated our fence, okay, and we have the reference hole where the drill goes right there. So you can set this up very easily. You put it up, you lower the drill in there, and that establishes the position of your hole, and you clamp this down, so you've had a one adjustment set up. And now when you put your little toy up there, and this is not square, it should be square, but when you put your little toy up there, you can flip the first flip stop down and you can drill this hole. All right, for this toy, you can flip that flip stop up and flip this one down and slide it up there and drill this hole. So by progressive flip stops on a drill press table, you can make a jig that will progressively drill you any spaced holes. And this is, we make 4 little trucks in the toy truck classes, and this is Norman's innovation on here, because Norm numbered the trucks 1, 2, 3, 4. And he said when you're making a number 1 truck, use the A and B flip stops. That's, where's my B flip stop, Norman?
You might have changed the jig since I wrote that.
Okay. Anyway, Norm put the legend up here, and he says on a number 1 truck you use A and B, on a 2 you use A and D, on a 3, which is a 6-wheel truck, you use A, C, and E, and on a 4 you use A and D. So here you got a multiple use jig simply because you use flip stops on it. And that is one of our prime toy making machines. The other thing is we make a little train, and let's see where my train base is. Every train has 5 of these, okay? This is the undercarriage to the little locomotive or the little car or whatever, and these dados aren't sawed out in it, but you have a choice when you're making something like this and you're making a 5-car train. It's not hard to make 5 of these and bandsaw it around and smooth it up because you're only making 1 train. If you got 12 students, you got 5 of these on each train, that's 60 of these you got to make in 1 day, which for a really skilled bandsawer, that's not much of a big deal. But if you take blocks unfinished and you line them up in here, you can put 20 of them in here, and you can screw this down, and you can use a 3/4 inch roundover bit in the router and run this down and turn it around and run it down and turn it around this way and run it down and turn it over, and you can make this piece 20 at a time for making the toys. That's you've done a couple of things there. You've used the router fence to good use. You have done this safer than you can hold this on the router fence like that, because that's not 3 inches. Okay, if you line 20 of them up at a time, you can make these 5 train bases, 5 trains at a time with a jig like this. This is a part positioning jig, and you use the router fence and this jig to establish the attitude of your work going through the router. Okay, that's another prime toy making jig. We have I think we had another one here. I don't see it, but I think we had another one for for, no, forget that. I didn't bring it out, I'm sorry. Let's see where we are on the presentation. That was toy jigs that we talked about. Let's talk about router jigs. And I don't know whether most of you are familiar with the term pattern routing or not. But that's where you can use a bearing guided bit to route certain shapes. And one of the places here in the shop that we'd use bearing guided bits and pattern routing very extensively. Everybody knows what this is. This is a cutting board, okay? How many of these have we made? Six jillion of them probably. But this is for pattern routing. The cutting board shape here, what is you glue some boards together and they may be whatever and sticking out all jagged. If you take this and you put it on your stock and draw around it, all right, and you go over to the bandsaw and you saw about 1/8 of an inch outside that line all the way around, and then you put some double-face tape on this and put it back on your cutting board, then you can go over to the router with a flush trim bit that has a bearing that rides right here, and you can take this and set it down and you can go around the router like that, and when you pull it off the tape you got a cutting board that's exactly this shape. Okay, that's pattern routing. Now there's another way you can do pattern routing, and we did this on the I got too many jigs up here. We did this on the Nancy Hiller desk. This is exactly the same idea. You want to make what's called a corbel for the inside corner of a desk like this, all right, or a table. And you want to make one of these. The first thing you do is put this piece in the jig and make you a line, and then go over to the bandsaw and you cut this out, leaving that much excess stock. Okay, you put it back in here and you screw that down, and now you can go over to the router again with the bearing guided router bit, and you note that up here I've marked the direction of the cut here. Now you can put that in the router and you can cut exactly to that line repeatedly. And if you want to make 2 disc, 4 disc, 44 disc, you can cut all of your corbels exactly the same way by doing pattern routing. Now, I'm going to show you something that may be a new concept to some of you, but you can also do pattern sawing. Have you ever done any pattern sawing? This is a pattern for a plaque that we as a guild project make for All-Star Trophy. And Gary Milkey has probably made hundreds of these things out of walnut, but this is the pattern. And let's see, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 cuts on the table saw that you would have to position here and here and here to cut and keep them all exactly the same angle and that kind of stuff. That is kind of tedious to do. But if you take, again, that same pattern routing or pattern sawing idea, okay, and this has drywall screws going through your template, and just the bare points or exposed there. You can take your stock and you can put this on top of here and you can whack it with your hammer because this is on the back side. Okay, now you have repositioned your fence. Okay, now you take this device here and you set it on your table saw. This is up against your regular fence. This is high enough for the edge of your material to go under. All right, and you clamp this to your regular fence, and now you run the edge of your template down this new fence that you've made, and you can turn it around and saw all of those corners, none of them square, against the new fence, and do it very safely because you set your saw blade right under here, and that's your cut line. You have established a cut line there. You can guide down this new fence that you have set up, and you can use your pattern to make 2 or 5 or 50 of these if you want to. So that's pattern sawing, and there's a lot of ways that you can do that. You just have to establish your pattern and establish what's called, this is called an L fence. If you ever run across the term, that is an L fence, and it attaches to your regular fence, leaves you clearance under here to where you can set the blade anywhere you want. And now you can run your pattern against this straight edge out here, and the blade cuts down here. And so it's a very handy way to do pattern sewing. Let's see where we are. We talked about the corbel or the bracket jig. Let's talk about a table leg jig. Many of you are not familiar with how this shop got started. And we had a project that we lovingly call the Andres Project. Has any of you been to Andres restaurant? Okay. Did you notice the furniture in there? The guild made that furniture. Remember the chair backs? All right. This is a template routing pattern where we glued up the stock, we fastened this to the back, sawed it with a bandsaw, and rode around with a bearing guided router bit, and we made backs for 90 chairs. Okay, and that gives you an idea of the value of pattern routing. And so that was the beginning of our shop. Now, on the Andres project, I want to draw your attention to something here because I want to show you a jig that I'm kind of proud of. You see that right there? There's a little table up there that our sign-in book is on, and it's got one of those on either end. It's a tenon that sticks through, and there's a little peg that fits on that. And this is the pattern for it, Andres table stretcher pin jig, and this is the pin that you make. All right, that is 2 3/4 inches long, I think. Anyway, can you make this safely on any machine in our shop? No, because you're too close to the blade. Okay, how would you do that? Think about it a minute. You've got several cuts to make. You got to make you a small block like that. Okay, it looks like this. Okay, you make a bunch of those. We made 26 of those tables on the first run, so that's 52 of these things we had to make. All exactly the same, incidentally. How would you do that? Anybody got any ideas on how to do that? John?
Something that clamps to the workbench upside down.
Well, I'll show you, okay? The first thing you do is make a pattern. This is what we've got to make, all right? And it says use 1-inch thick stock. That's this stock right here. And I sawed a bunch of little blocks like this, all right? Now, I made me a jig. All right, this is the jig. You remember the table runner concept? All right, I've established that table runner, and now I've got my saw cut established. And I take those little blocks, and the first one, when I run it over the saw, the first one sticking in here gets a cut like that. All right, in the same stroke, the one that's sitting up here gets a cut like that. All right, all I have to do now is take my little pattern that I made and fit on here and draw around it, and now I can go over to the table saw or to the bandsaw, and I can start here and I can just saw all the way around here. And you say, hey, wait a minute, you're nearer to the blade than 3 inches, right? So what do you do in that case? You know what a furniture clamp is? The little 2 wooden blocks with the hand screws on them. You can take a 4-inch one that is just really a cute little thing, and you can clamp it right on here, and you can hold the little handles and you can guide it through your saw just perfectly. Okay? So when you want to make these, you make your little jig like this. You mount up 2 of those. Your first cut's there, your second cut is there. And yeah, and you use one of these down here like and incidentally, this is handy for you working with the router on a lot of small type pieces. If you would remember to do this, it's a lot safer. Okay, now I can see my lines on that. I can get up to my bandsaw and I cut around just like that. So get in the habit of using these little things. They're pretty handy. And that's the jig for making those little table. There you go, right there. It positions the pins. It saws the pin long side, it saws the pin angle, and you finish and shape the pin on your bandsaw. So that's a special jig you make. You may not ever need one of those, but I want you to get the concept because you can use the jig to position your material for the cut. And that is the whole concept of the jig, is using the jig to position your material for the cut that you want to make. There is a special jig that we use in the shop in the intermediate woodworking shop, and I said there was no Swiss Army knife jig. This comes about as close to it as I've ever seen. But this is a jig for cutting what's called locking rabbet joints, either in a corner of a cabinet or a drawer front. And I'll draw the joint for you right quick because it's a hard thing to visualize. But when you have a drawer front like this, and you want to cut this piece to where it fits in just exactly like that. Okay, this is a 3-position jig here, and this fence, we relocated this fence, and we have adjusted the depth of cut. You can run this up and down, and there's a lug on the bottom and that establishes the cut on this piece right here. That makes this cut, but it makes it full length. Now, if you go over and you lay your side piece flat, this piece, lay it down right here on the A stop. See A? Okay, if you lay it down on the A stop and slide it up here, it will make that slotted cut. Now you had a cut made up here that you got to saw half of it off. All right, you flip that up and flip that down, and it makes this cut. All right, so you made 3 cuts with the same jig. First cut, second cut, third cut. And you've done that by repositioning fences, and you've done it with flip stops, okay? Same concept as a stop block, but you don't have to clamp it. You just have to flip it down, okay? So that's stops and flip stops and whatever, but that is a locking rabbit jig. And incidentally, that's not my idea. That is a Woodsmith jig. They published it in one of their magazines some years ago, and I made one of them. And if you, I don't know, any of you subscribe to Woodsmith? Woodsmith is a very, very good source of both plans and jigs. They have numerous jigs in their catalog where you can buy the plan for them, and they always work. Woodsmith is a very good source of jig ideas and plans for your furniture. Because of my experience, if you use a Woodsmith plan and you go exactly by it, it will turn out looking like the picture that they put up there. And
Hey, Dave.
yes.
We have a copy of all the digital publications of Woodsmith Magazine and the shop notes on the library computer back there.
Okay. Yeah, if you want to go in there and look at that. That jig is defined in there, and I made it according to the plan, but I made it for the intermediate woodworking class because we were doing locking rabbets on the drawer corner, and that's an easy way to do it. It's maddening if you try to do it any other way. Okay, let's see where we are. My computer shut itself down. You got tired of me talking.
Dave, you can see it on screen, it's the next slide.
Okay, we talked about the taple leg jig. Now, we talked about the tenon pin jig. Now let's talk about a special jig or some special jigs for making, for the Andres project, we made 90 Swiss peasant chairs with that kind of back on them and 8-sided tapered legs. Okay? Anybody got any good ideas on how to make an 8-sided tapered leg? Okay. I'll pass that around if you want to look at it. I've got another one here to talk to. The way you make an 8-sided tapered leg is obviously you've got to use the lathe to cut your tenon there, because this sticks in a bolster on the bottom of the chair. And this is 1.5 inches long, and it's 1.25 inches in diameter. I think it's 1.25 inches in diameter. But on a lathe, you cut that first, and you got 1.5 inch square piece right there. And you've got to figure out how to get the 8 tapered facets on it. Okay, let me show the jig to do that, because when we were gearing up for that project, we had several long evenings arguing about the best way to do that. All right, because in order to make those 8 sides, you gotta be able to turn this, right? And we already did that because we put it in lathe. We drilled a center on both ends to turn that tenon there. Well, you just make a jig now to mount that up in. And you can lock it down. All right, I've done something here. I've used the centers and a sled. See the runner? This is a sled. And I use the sled to relocate my fence. Now my fence is this runner. And now I can go by the blade over here and I can saw that facet. All right, and I can turn it and I can saw another facet until I turn it around 8 times. And then you say, but you're crazy because you have to turn it exactly the same amount every time to get those facets even and everything. Well, I started out with a square piece. All right, and it had an edge sticking out here, which meant there was the same edge sticking over here. And instead of, we had a guy that fancied himself as a jig maker, and somehow or other he came up with this idea of I gotta get a splinter out of my hand here. He came up with this idea of a sprocket and a chain and a degree wheel over here to where you could change the angle of this thing any way you wanted it, and it would have probably cost us $1,500 to make the jig. But because you've got a square corner there, you can take a 90-degree block and you can slide it in here and you can index that point over here and you can saw it off and you can saw all of the faces using this locking block because it's 90 degrees. And you say, well, hey, when you cut that one off, you no longer have 90 degrees. What do you have? You got 45. Okay, it's like that. Now I've got a 45-degree angle 8 times. And what's two 45-degree angles?
90 degrees.
A 90-degree angle, so I can use this same block against two 45-degree faces and lock it in place. And that way I can index it around the 45-degree angle still using a 90-degree block. And I've used my centers offset to get the taper. So I've done a number of things here. I've changed my cut line by tapering it. I've changed my fence by the table runner, and I have come up with an indexing mechanism using a 90-degree block. And that is a jig for making an 8-sided chair leg. Pardon?
Jiminy Christmas.
And it works every time because we made 90 chairs. How many legs is that?
360.
360. This worked at least 360 times.
Times 8 sides.
Ironically, just this morning on Woodsmith Shop that you were talking about, they made a jig that was basically 2 round holes standing up that they could put a square leg through and then use a dado blade on the table saw and just spin it in that jig to cut the round tenon that you were talking about. So for those of us without a lathe,
Yeah, you
if
could
they
do that.
look up that show, it looked like a really simple jig. Basically, 2 round holes that the square thing fits through and holds it above the top of a dado blade.
Okay.
Here you go.
I'll show you a couple of other jigs here, and then I want to get on to the meat of this story. This is one of my trade pieces. I made the first one of these. It was made around the shop, but we've made about 6 jillion of them. This is called a shaker step. Okay, it's a handy little step stool that you can step up and get to a high shelf. You can get up on a high bed, which the shaker's beds were high beds because they had a trundle bed underneath them. And if you don't want to use it for that, you can use it for a plant stand, or it makes a nice seat for your cat. But this is put together with 2 dowel pins here on either end of it. 2 here and 2 here. You know what the hardest part of making this is? It's not hand cutting the dovetails. You can learn how to do that pretty easy. The hardest part of making this thing is locating these 2 dowels to where they go exactly into this stretcher here and don't blow out the sides. Okay? Got any ideas on how to do that? You want some kind of guide to get your dowel holes in the right place, right? And you need to line them up. Incidentally, these are put in at a slight angle so they will have a dovetailing effect and hold this whole thing together. But you want to be able to center that and get the holes in the right place, and maybe locate those stretcher holes at the same time and make this easy. Well, there's an easy way to do it. Okay? You make you one of these. It's got 2 holes for the dowels, and it locates the dowels on the center of this piece right here. So I got me a fence right there. I got me a fence here which lines it up on this piece, and I got me a fence back here which locates it exactly on the center stretcher. And if I put it right there and clamp it down, I can drill holes right there, and it's lined up exactly to go in the end of that stretcher. So I can drill all the holes at the same time and get them in exactly the right place. And since I've made this, I've not blown one hole out. So if you want to make shaker steps, make one of these and make it easier. Okay. Incidentally, if any of you are interested, we have conducted and we can conduct a class on making one of these in one day and hand cutting the dovetails. So if you're interested, talk to Kevin. All right. I want to get on to my last fun thing here. And any of you familiar with these things? I know Norman is. Yes. In the basic class, we make little little glue scrapers, because beginning woodworkers always do what? They always use too much glue. Okay? Remember, when you're working with wood and using glue, the glue that squeezes out doesn't glue anything. Okay? It just junk, because you can't put it back in the bottle, and you need some little something to scrape that off with. Well, it's kind of tedious. I like this. Norman has started people making them just a little bit longer, but I've been making these since I was 10 years old, and that's a long time. And I like this size because it just fits in my hand, and it fit in my pocket or my apron pocket, wherever I want to use it. I can always whip it out and scrape glue. If I want to scrape a label off of something, or if I want to scrape a pencil mark off of something, or if I want to take a rough board and I want to scrape the roughness off so I can look at the grain. Handy little tool. You'll find out if you make you one of these, you can't woodwork without it. There's probably a dozen of these laying around my basement workshop, and invariably every time I go down there I go looking for one to do something. They're made with a paint scraper blade. 2 of these come in a package. Use one of them in a deal like this. Now the problem is making this little thing here is closer than 3 inches to the bandsaw I've got to use to cut this little face here. And on a drill press I can get against the fence and I can drill that. But I also need to router the outside edges of this, and that's closer than 3 inches to the router. So how do you make one of these little blocks? Okay, I'll show you how. There's a picture here that says it better than I can. Oh, my computer shut itself down again.
There's a picture, Dave. On the screen.
On the monitors.
Okay, what you do is you take a block that's 2 of these things long, all right, and you drill a 5/16 hole, 1 1/4 inches from the end on each end, and you make a bandsaw slot going back to the hole, and then you put it on a jig. Okay, let me show you the jig. Here's the jig. All right, it's made for my bandsaw because this lug is, the blade is over here. All right, if I put that little block in there, I've got this sticking in there. I can run it down the blade, it'll saw that cheek off. If I turn it over like this, it saws this cheek off. If I turn it around, I can repeat that distance, and I end up with this. If I go to the table saw with my stop block, I can saw all these in half exactly this long, okay? And then if I go to my router and hold this down and use a coping sled, I can do a 3/8 round over on either side of it, and I can come up with one of these little things. It's really handy, except the way my jig works, I make 2. Now sometimes when you're doing stuff like this, it's so much fun that you get carried away and you make more than one. As a matter of fact, I got carried away the other day and I made a whole box full right here. Okay, I made a whole box full, and I think there's enough in here to go around. So I'm going to pass them around, and if you'd like to have a glue scraper, take one, okay?
Incidentally, I have 2 that you made several years ago that I use in my shop every day.
Every day. You can't work without them, right, Russ?
That's right.
So take one and enjoy using it. And if we get to the last slide, Chris, the jig is up. The end. That's all I know about jig making, guys. Thank you for being here.
One quick note on jigs that I use in my shop. I always put a date on them when I make them, and if they're not used again in a year, they're thrown away or salvaged.
Oh.
I don't have a lot of space.
Oh. You see how many I've got. This is a small collection of them.
Hey, Dave, for the Kratz right here in front. Right here. For the Kratz sanding block, did you have jigs for that as well?
You don't need one. It's very easy to make.
Okay.
I can show you how. Yeah, that's. I know the dimensions by heart. As a matter of fact, that sanding block is not my idea. That sanding block was made by Montgomery Ward Company, which some of you don't remember that company, but that was made by the Montgomery Ward Company. And I bought one of those blocks when I was 15 years old, and I still have it, and it still has the original price marked on it. It was 59 cents. And so I've been using that pattern all of these years, but I think at one point in time I made, well, actually 2 different runs. I made 200, and one run I made 100, and we brought them down here and sold them for $3 a piece or 2 for $5 and put in the gill kitty. But we made those out of the scrap poplar from the first turf box run.
Okay.
So yeah, we can make those anytime you want. Yes.
I've got something here. I'm not a member here, but Joe talked me into coming down today. But I've got something here that may be of interest to you.
Okay.
These are safety glasses with bifocals, upper and lower.
Okay.
And if you've never worked with bifocals with uppers, you won't go without them. These you can buy through U.S. Safety Glasses. It's online, and they're about $15 a pair.
Yeah,
And they are great. You can get from.
These are progressive trifocals, and
You can get your whatever your bifocal it needs is like 2.0 or 2.5 or 3.0.
okay.
You can buy whatever you need. But I've been wearing upper and lower bifocals for years, and I found these online, and they are wonderful.
Okay, guys, if you need safety glasses, that's a good idea.
We have a
Question? Oh, one of our sponsors, right there.
Anybody else have a question? Dave, thank you for.
Thank you, Dave.
A special thank you to our guest today, to the Guild's Leadership Committee, and to all of our sponsors. For more information about the Guild, upcoming classes, and events, please visit our website kcwg.org. You can also find us on social media by searching for Kansas City Woodworkers Guild. And remember to hit the subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications.